You are listening to Fate in the Cosmos by Elton Thomas, Part 1, Chapters 1 through 5. Chapter 1, Journey. On the farthest edge of the solar system, Kosma drifted silently in the cold expanse of space, cloaked by darkness. From a distance, it appeared as nothing more than a rogue planet, unbound by the gravitational pull of a star, but within its core, life thrived in the form of the Dwellers. Their world had been a self-sustaining marvel for millennia, a technological wonder hidden from the rest of the universe. Lonni stood in the preparation bay of the Watcher, her slender form bathed in the pale light emanating from the vessel's energy core. Like all Dwellers, her skin shimmered, reflecting light like polished silver. Her eyes, large and dark, absorbed the data scrolling before her with meticulous focus. She was preparing herself for the most intriguing journey she had undertaken, the analysis of Earth's inhabitants. The craft was small and efficient, its purpose singular, to observe and study. Lonni's task was one of critical importance, gathering real-time data on human behavior. It was a task that stirred an odd excitement within her, though she showed no outward expression of it. The Dwellers did not experience emotion in the way humans did, but they harbored an intense drive for knowledge, a hunger to understand the complexity of other species. As Lonni adjusted the settings on her data collection devices, she telepathically communicated with the rest of the crew. In an instant, their thoughts synchronized. "Are we ready?" she asked, though the question was more rhetorical than curious. Lonni was always precise in her work. "Nearly," came the response from Eris, their pilot. His posture was straight, poised, as he stood at the controls of the Watcher. Eris's form rippled subtly, a sign of readiness. "Final trajectory calculations are complete. We'll enter orbit within the hour." Mira, the biologist, sat in a low chair across from Lonni. Her fingers tapped against her armrest, a rare physical movement for a Dweller, but it was a habit she had picked up during their long journey through space. "I've always wondered," she projected with a curious tilt to her head, "what it would feel like to truly interact with a species so attached to their senses. Sight, taste, sound. They are slaves to the physical world." A ripple of agreement passed through the group, though none responded openly. Instead, Voron, the team's specialist in human technology, injected a note of humor into the mental conversation. "Let's hope this time we don't confuse their fiction for reality. Remember the early days? We almost believed their transmissions of giant metal men and space wars." The memory floated through the minds of the group, drawing a collective chuckle, a sensation more felt than heard, like a gentle reverberation in the mind. The early days of intercepting Earth's radio signals had been a strange time. The Dwellers, unfamiliar with the concept of fiction, had taken every broadcast at face value, much to their later embarrassment. Now, they were far more discerning, able to filter through the vast swathes of human imagination and find the truth hidden beneath. "It was the program with the talking vehicle," Kala chimed in, her tone light, a rare levity for her. "For a moment, I genuinely thought that humans had achieved sentient machines." "Well, they might still surprise us," Eris added, though his focus remained on guiding the craft. Lonni's thoughts, however, were on the mission ahead. Earth, the planet they had studied from afar for centuries, now close enough to touch, to understand in ways the Dwellers had never experienced before. She had spent cycles preparing for this, sorting through vast amounts of human data, images, broadcasts, and written language, to get a sense of their subject. But there was something about humans that defied mere data. Despite their seemingly chaotic nature, their propensity for creativity, and their constant need for emotional expression, Lonni felt a fascination with them. The Dwellers, in their perfection, had long since moved beyond the need for such things. Art, music, creativity, it had no place in their lives. Yet here they were, traveling to a world where such things were the very core of existence. As the team approached Earth, they watched it grow larger on the view screen. A planet of blue and green, streaked with white clouds, it was vibrant in a way Kosma was not. The Dwellers' home had long since lost its atmosphere, its surface devoid of life, but here, life thrived in chaotic abundance. "Begin selection of observation subjects," Lonni instructed, her posture rigid as she focused on the screen. The crew's collective thoughts moved in unison, filtering through millions of potential candidates. Lonni scanned through the data. She could see the lives of humans unfold in streams of information: births, deaths, movements, conversations. It was all there, laid bare for analysis. Her task was to find the ones who would offer the most insight. And then she found her. Stacy Sims, Lonni projected, her voice calm, decisive. The image of a young woman appeared on the screen. Stacy was in her studio, surrounded by half-finished paintings, her fingers stained with the vibrant colors of her art. She was expressive, every brushstroke an extension of her emotions, every movement purposeful yet erratic. Lonni could see it, the raw energy that flowed through this woman. An artist, a creator, someone who lived outside the structured confines of logic and data. The Dwellers had no concept of art, no understanding of creation for creation's sake. Yet here was Stacy, a human who embodied everything the Dwellers could not grasp. For that reason alone, she intrigued Lonni. "She will be our first subject," Lonni declared, her voice cutting through the thoughts of the others. "I will begin observations immediately." As Lonni settled into her pod, preparing to interface directly with the sensory equipment, she couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to witness the world through Stacy's eyes. To see what drove her, to understand the strange force humans called inspiration. The journey had begun, and for the first time in many cycles, Lonni felt something akin to anticipation. Chapter 2. Stacy Sims. Stacy Sims stood in front of her latest piece, a sprawling landscape of the Missouri River at sunset, the colors swirling and merging in a way that made the canvas come alive. Every detail, from the reflection of the fading sun on the water to the delicate blades of grass along the shore, was rendered with such precision that it could easily be mistaken for a photograph. But this was no photograph. This was Stacy's art, her world, where every stroke of the brush was deliberate, a part of her very soul. Her studio, nestled in the heart of the Grove in St. Louis, was a sanctuary. It smelled of oil paints and freshly primed canvases, a scent that always grounded her, brought her focus. Large windows allowed soft daylight to pour in, illuminating the space where she spent countless hours. The Grove, with its colorful murals and eclectic mix of art galleries, cafes, and music venues, was the perfect environment for Stacy. But despite the vibrancy surrounding her, she kept to herself. Stacy was an introvert at heart, content to observe life rather than immerse herself in it. She stretched, feeling the satisfying pull in her muscles after hours spent at the easel. Her hands, still stained with hues of burnt orange and deep blue, reminded her of the passage of time. She glanced at the clock on the wall, nearly 5:30 p.m. Her exhibit downtown was starting soon, and she had barely enough time to catch the next train. Quickly cleaning her hands and throwing on her coat, she grabbed her purse and slung it over her shoulder. She could feel the familiar pang of anxiety tightening in her chest, the thought of being late gnawing at her. Stacy had no time for mistakes tonight. This exhibit was important. It was her chance to connect with potential buyers, something she'd always struggled with. Not because her art wasn't good enough. No, Stacy knew her work spoke for itself. But because the thought of interacting with strangers exhausted her. Still, she had to make an appearance. She stepped out of her studio into the crisp evening air, the familiar hum of the Grove's nightlife stirring to life. The sidewalks were already filling with people, some with paint-splattered aprons like hers, others holding cups of coffee as they drifted from gallery to gallery. Stacy weaved her way through the crowd, her steps quick and purposeful as she headed for the Metrolink station at Central West End. The station was bustling, its concrete platforms crowded with people waiting for the train into the city. The rhythmic screech of the tracks and the metallic hum of the trains echoed through the open space, a familiar sound to Stacy. She could see the train pulling up in the distance, the headlights cutting through the dimness of dusk. Her heart sped up. She quickened her pace, hoping to catch it before the doors closed. As she descended the stairs to the platform, her mind raced through the evening ahead. She visualized the exhibit, the placement of her paintings, the people milling around sipping wine. The thought sent a flutter of nerves through her stomach. She wasn't good at small talk, at pretending to be interested in things that weren't art, But tonight, she would have to. This was her chance to solidify herself in the local art scene. She couldn't afford to miss it. The train was already at the platform when Stacy arrived, its doors sliding open with a soft hiss. She broke into a jog, her boots clapping against the concrete as she darted past a group of tourists with large bags. She could feel the cool air rush against her cheeks as she made her way to the train, her breath coming in short, quick bursts. Her timing was perfect. Just as the final chime sounded, Stacy slipped inside the carriage. She exhaled in relief, her shoulders sagging slightly as she settled into one of the few empty seats. Her hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline wore off, but she allowed herself a small smile. She'd made it. As the train prepared to pull away from the station, Stacy reached into her purse, a habit she'd developed whenever she had a spare moment. But as her fingers brushed the bottom of the bag, her heart skipped a beat. Her phone. It wasn't there. A wave of panic surged through her. She rifled through her purse, her movements becoming more frantic. No phone. Her mind raced, replaying the moment she'd rushed onto the train. Had it fallen? She turned sharply toward the train doors, her pulse quickening as she scanned the platform outside. There it was. Lying on the ground, just a few feet from the edge of the platform, her phone sat still, unnoticed by the bustling crowd. Without thinking, Stacy leapt to her feet, rushing to the door. Her fingers curled around the edge of the handrail as she stared at the phone, willing it to somehow return to her. The train was still stopped, but the doors were about to close, the city skyline just visible in the distance. And then, a figure appeared. A man, ordinary, dressed in a dark jacket, stepped forward, his gaze landing on the phone. He bent down, picked it up, and looked toward Stacy through the door as they began to shut. Their eyes met, just for a moment. There was something in that brief exchange, a recognition that neither fully understood. Before she could react, the man tossed the phone through the narrow gap as the doors began to close. With a soft thud, it landed in her hands just as the train started to move. Stacy stood frozen for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. She blinked, clutching the phone as if it were some rare gift. She turned her gaze back to the man on the platform, now shrinking into the distance as the train gained speed. He was already blending into the crowd, a fleeting figure in her otherwise controlled world. The moment passed, and Stacy returned to her seat, her pulse still racing. She turned the phone over in her hands, checking it, as if reassuring herself that it was real. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, but it quickly faded as the reality of her night ahead settled back in. There was no time to dwell on strange encounters. She had an exhibit to get to. Far above the city, Lonni observed the entire scene from the safety of the watcher. Her gaze was fixed on Stacy, her telepathic mind sorting through every detail, every action, every fleeting expression on the human's face. To Lonni, the moment had been nothing more than a simple coincidence, a human man at the right place at the right time. She observed how Stacy's initial panic shifted into relief, how her face softened as the phone was returned to her hands. Coincidence, Lonni mused to herself. Nothing more. The Dwellers didn't believe in fate. Everything had a cause, a logical sequence of events. The man had simply been there, no more significant than a passing cloud. Lonni logged the interaction with detached interest and moved on. But somewhere deep in the recesses of her mind, Lonni felt a small flicker of something unfamiliar. She brushed it aside. Data was what mattered. Results. And Stacy Sims was proving to be an interesting subject, with or without the illusion of fate. Chapter 3. John Colt. Lonni hovered in a state of quiet contemplation aboard the Watcher, her telepathic gaze fixed on her data screens as they displayed an intricate analysis of Stacy Sims. It had been a week since Lonni had chosen Stacy as her first subject, and the woman had proven to be a compelling study, with her passionate relationship to her art and her quiet, introverted existence. Each day, Lonni cataloged Stacy's habits, expressions, and emotional nuances, logging everything with detached precision. But something had begun to stir within Lonni, a flicker of curiosity that deviated from her usual methodical nature. The encounter at the Metrolink platform, the moment Stacy's phone was returned to her by the stranger, still lingered in her mind. The man's brief appearance, his presence at that exact moment, had sparked an anomaly in Lonnie's data. In the days since, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. Who was he? What was his significance? She accessed the data again, tracing the moment their eyes had met. John Colt. His name was now etched into Lonnie's records, and as she began to study his profile, an odd sense of recognition arose. John's life was steeped in the same logical analysis that governed the Dwellers' very existence. He was a business analyst, and his worldview was governed by data and observation, much like the Dwellers themselves. Fate, as humans called it, was a concept he outright rejected. Like Lonni, John preferred facts over chance, order over chaos. Interesting, Lonni thought. Very interesting. John Colt spent his Saturday afternoon with a group of friends at the Del Mar Loop, a lively district filled with shops, restaurants, and entertainment venues. The smell of grilled food and the hum of laughter permeated the air, and the energy of the place pulsed through the streets, even on a relatively calm day. John stood at a pool table inside a bar nestled along the main strip, his fingers lightly gripping the edge of his cue as he sized up his next shot. "Come on, John. It's an easy bank," his friend Darnell called out from across the table. He leaned on his own cue stick, a playful grin spreading across his face. John's eyes flicked from the cue ball to the target, his mind calculating the angles with precision. Every game of pool was, to him, a microcosm of life itself, a series of actions, each governed by the laws of physics and geometry. No luck, just skill and focus. "Easy for you to say," John replied, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. His tone was casual, but inside, he was fully locked in. He positioned himself, lowered the cue, and with a controlled motion, struck the ball. It ricocheted off the side, kissed the corner pocket, and dropped in with a satisfying thud. "Boom!" John exclaimed softly, standing up straight, a proud smile breaking across his normally serious face. His friends groaned in mock disappointment, but John simply shrugged, chuckling to himself as he set the cue back on the rack. The afternoon had been a good one, a rare break from the constant cycle of data and deadlines at work. But now, it was time to head home. John stepped out of the bar, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the bustling streets of the Del Mar Loop. The air was cooler now, and as he walked down the sidewalk, his mind shifted back to his usual thoughts. Projects, data sets, reports. John's brain was always working, dissecting information, analyzing trends. It was his way of making sense of the world. At the end of the block, the bright red and yellow trolley that ran along the loop came into view, its cheerful clanging bell cutting through the evening air. John smiled faintly. He always enjoyed taking the trolley. There was something charming about its slow, deliberate pace, like a moving time capsule that offered a brief respite from the chaos of modern life. He stepped aboard, his gaze briefly scanning the half-empty seats. Finding a spot near the back, he settled in, his mind wandering to the tasks awaiting him at home. But as the trolley began to pull away from the curb, John's hand instinctively patted his pocket. A pang of panic gripped him. His keys were missing. He bolted upright, his heart hammering in his chest as he scanned the floor around him. They weren't there. A sickening realization hit him. He must have dropped them on the street when he got on the trolley. John leaned out the window, his eyes frantically searching the sidewalk as the trolley began to gather speed. There, lying near the curb, just where he had been standing, were his keys, glinting in the fading light. But before he could react, he saw someone else had spotted them. It was a woman, her figure silhouetted against the backdrop of the setting sun. She bent down, picked up the keys, and for a brief second, their eyes locked. It was her. The lady who dropped her phone. John's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen her since that fleeting moment at the Metrolink platform, but there she was, holding his keys in her hand, staring back at him with the same look of disbelief that must have been on his face. The trolley doors had already closed, and it was pulling away from the stop, but before the distance grew too great, Stacy took a quick step forward and threw the keys toward him. With an effortless flick of her wrist, they sailed through the open window, landing in John's lap just as the trolley pulled away. John's heart raced, not from the missed keys, but from the sheer improbability of the moment. He sat back in his seat, clutching the keys in his hand, and as the trolley rattled down the street, he turned to look back at Stacy. She stood on the sidewalk, watching him disappear into the distance. "You?" she called out, her voice faint against the hum of the trolley. John blinked, his lips forming the same word as it escaped in a half-whisper. "You?" Far above the city, Lonnie's sensors flickered with data. The anomaly that had begun on the Metrolink platform had resurfaced, and as she processed the information, she found herself confronted with an inexplicable truth. The same two individuals, Stacy and John, had now shared two separate encounters, both under circumstances so unlikely that the very fabric of probability strained against the logic of it. Her telepathic mind hummed with calculations. She plugged in the numbers: 1.6 million people in the combined areas of St. Louis City and County, 584 square miles of terrain, and 86,400 seconds in a day. Lonni processed the data, fact after fact, calculation after calculation, leading her to a single, undeniable result. 1 in 1.6 billion. That was the probability of these two humans encountering each other in the way they had. An impossibility almost. A cosmic glitch, a ripple in the orderly sequence of events that governed the universe. Lonni sat back, her mind awash with the weight of this realization. The cosmos, for all its precision, allowed for anomalies. Rare, but not impossible. And as fascinating as this anomaly was, Lonni had no choice but to accept it for what it was: a statistical outlier. Yet, deep within her, a small spark of curiosity began to grow. She decided then and there that Stacy Sims and John Colt were worth a closer study. Chapter 4. The Dwellers' Discussion. The Watcher hummed quietly as it settled into its orbit around Earth. From within, the Dwellers had a perfect vantage point to observe the planet below, a swirling mass of blue, green, and white. They hovered in silence, their minds connected by telepathic threads, sharing observations without the need for spoken words. The control room was bathed in a soft, ambient light that shimmered off the metallic walls, reflecting the Dwellers' sleek forms. Lonni stood at her station, her eyes flickering with streams of data projected before her, her posture as still as a statue. The Watcher's systems were stable, allowing for a moment of reflection. "Orbit confirmed. All systems are operational," Eris relayed, his mind calm and focused. His form rippled slightly, a sign of satisfaction at the ship's smooth trajectory. The crew gathered in the common chamber, a spacious area lined with glowing panels that displayed information about their mission. The air was filled with a quiet hum, the ship's energy core a constant reminder of their distant home. "Shall we review?" Mira inquired, her telepathic voice tinged with curiosity. Her fingers traced the lines of a crystalline interface where she had catalogued her biological findings on the humans. "Indeed," Voron replied. His posture was relaxed, though his mind was ever vigilant, sorting through the latest data on human technology. "I've been compiling an analysis on their infrastructural patterns. Quite inefficient, if you ask me. Their reliance on manual labor and fossil fuels remains primitive compared to what we've achieved." The group shared a collective sense of amusement, though none of them physically smiled. The Dwellers had long surpassed the need for energy sources like those used on Earth. To them, the human reliance on oil, coal, and other such resources seemed archaic, like watching a species trapped in an evolutionary bottleneck. "Humans are fascinating nonetheless," Kala projected, her thoughts tinged with intrigue. "They breathe through two openings on their faces, the mouth and the nose, but occasionally they exhale through other means." She paused, and a ripple of shared amusement passed through the group. Eris was the first to respond, his thoughts flowing with a touch of humor. "I observed that as well. It's rather curious. Their bodies seem to be filled with unnecessary complications. Their need for constant air intake, water, and food seems cumbersome. How do they live with such inefficiencies?" Lonni remained silent as the others shared their thoughts. Her mind was occupied by something else, something far more perplexing than biological curiosities. "They spend nearly half of their lives unconscious," Mira noted, her telepathic tone layered with fascination. "Sleeping, as they call it. I've studied the phenomenon. Humans require long periods of rest to recover their physical and mental energy. Imagine the time they waste in such states." "A third of their lives at minimum," Voron added, his telepathic voice calm but judgmental. It's astonishing. How do they achieve anything with such limitations? Their bodies seem fragile, inefficient. And yet, his mind hesitated. They thrive. They also pretend to be other animals, Kala pointed out, tilting her head as she reviewed her data. I found several cases where they dress up as creatures they fear or hunt. Why mimic something you eat? It's illogical. This sparked a ripple of agreement, though beneath the surface, Lonnie's mind churned with a different thought. While the others found humor in these observations, she was preoccupied with the anomaly she had calculated earlier. Humans speak of peace, yet they are in a constant state of conflict, Mira said, steering the discussion in another direction. They wage wars while advocating for peace. Their actions contradict their words. The irony was not lost on the Dwellers. Their own species had long since moved beyond war. Conflict was a thing of the past, resolved through data, analysis, and negotiation. Yet here was a planet filled with creatures constantly at odds with one another. They place value on inanimate objects, sometimes even over life itself, Voron added, his telepathic voice resonating with disbelief. I've seen it. Humans fighting over pieces of paper they call money, over land, over resources that could be shared. It's as if they fail to see the greater good. The group fell into a quiet contemplation, the weight of their observations settling over them like a shroud. For all the progress humans had made, they still seemed trapped in cycles of violence, consumption, and contradiction. The Dwellers, logical and detached, found it difficult to understand. And yet, for all their analysis, Lonni couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to humans, something that couldn't be reduced to simple data points. There is an anomaly, Lonni finally projected, breaking her silence. Her telepathic voice was calm but deliberate, drawing the attention of the others. An anomaly? Eris inquired, his thoughts shifting to focus on her. What kind of anomaly? Lonni accessed the data stream she had logged earlier, presenting it to the group. It involves two humans, Stacy Sims and John Colt. They have encountered each other twice, in separate locations, under circumstances that defy logical probability. I've calculated the odds. The probability of these two individuals meeting in the way they have is 1 in 1.6 billion. A ripple of surprise passed through the group. Voron's telepathic voice was the first to respond. That is, statistically improbable. Fascinating, Mira added, her thoughts racing through the implications. But what does it mean? It means that despite our calculations, there are forces at work we may not fully understand, Lonni replied, her posture remaining rigid. I've reviewed the data multiple times. There is no logical explanation for their repeated encounters. The others considered this in silence, their minds turning over the possibilities. Perhaps it's merely coincidence, Eris suggested, an outlier in the grand scheme. Perhaps, Lonni agreed, though a lingering doubt tugged at her. But what if it isn't? What if there are other forces at play, forces we cannot measure with data alone? The thought hung in the air, suspended in the shared consciousness of the group. For the Dwellers, everything had always been measurable, quantifiable. The idea that there could be something beyond their understanding was unsettling. Are there anomalies like this on Kosma? Kala asked, her telepathic tone curious. Lonni hesitated, her mind reaching back through the vast expanse of her memories. No, she replied after a moment. Not that I can recall. Our world operates on data, logic, and precision. Anomalies do not exist in the same way. The group fell into silence once more, each of them processing the implications of Lonnie's words. If anomalies didn't exist on Kosma, what did that mean for their study of Earth? Was this planet somehow different, governed by forces they couldn't comprehend? We should report this, Voron finally suggested, to the leaders of Kosma. They will want to know about this anomaly. Not yet, Lonni replied firmly. The study is far from over. We need more data, more observations. We cannot present an incomplete analysis. The others nodded in agreement, their minds synchronizing with Lonnie's resolve. The study would continue, and they would watch the humans more closely than ever before. As the discussion drew to a close, Lonni remained at her station, her gaze fixed on the glowing orb of Earth below. The anomaly, as improbable as it was, weighed heavily on her mind. For the first time in her long existence, she wondered if there was more to the universe than data and results. Chapter 5. The John and Stacy Study. For 3 weeks, Lonni meticulously cataloged every detail of Stacy Sims and John Colt's lives. Their routines, their work, their hobbies, everything was recorded and analyzed with the same precision she had applied to her past studies. Yet, as each day passed, Lonni found herself drawn deeper into the complexities of human life, particularly how John and Stacy, though strangers, seemed to linger in each other's thoughts. It was a phenomenon she had never encountered before. The Watcher hovered silently in its steady orbit, its sleek form blending into the shadowy void of space. Inside, Lonni sat at her station, her eyes fixed on the data streaming before her. The faint hum of the ship's systems was the only sound, a constant backdrop to her observations. For Lonni, time passed in measured moments, each second filled with a wealth of information about the two humans she now knew intimately. Stacy's studio, nestled in the heart of the grove, became a familiar sight. Lonni observed her in her element, surrounded by canvases, each brushstroke deliberate, each color a reflection of the artist's inner world. Stacy's fingers moved with purpose, her hands often stained with paint, her expression a mix of focus and quiet contemplation. It was in these moments that Lonni saw Stacy's true self, an introvert who poured her emotions into her art, finding solace in the silence of her studio. Lonni noted the patterns in Stacy's day, the way she started each morning with a cup of coffee, her eyes distant as she stared out of the large windows of her studio, how she often lost herself in her work for hours, only pausing when the daylight faded, casting long shadows across her paintings. Stacy's world was small but rich, filled with the textures of her art, the soft hum of music in the background, and the occasional interruptions of life outside. On the other side of the city, John Colt's life unfolded in a very different rhythm. As a business analyst, John's days were structured and precise. Lonni watched him pore over datasets, his mind always working, calculating, dissecting information with an efficiency that was almost dweller-like. His office was a world of order, filled with screens displaying graphs and numbers, his desk meticulously organized, every item in its place. Lonni observed how John approached each task with a quiet intensity, his brow furrowing as he concentrated, his fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. Yet, despite his logical mind and his preference for data over emotion, there were moments when John's thoughts drifted, moments when his mind returned to that brief encounter at the Metrolink platform or the trolley. Stacy's face would flash in his memory, and for a second, he would wonder who she was, why their paths had crossed twice in such unlikely circumstances. Lonni could sense it, this subtle pull, this curiosity that seemed to defy logic. John didn't know Stacy's name, didn't even know who she was, yet she lingered in his thoughts like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. It was the same for Stacy. In the quiet moments between her brushstrokes, her mind would drift to the man on the trolley, the stranger who had returned her phone. Who was he? She wondered. Why did their paths keep crossing? As Lonni catalogued these fleeting thoughts, she found herself growing more fascinated by the human capacity for longing. It was something foreign to her, a yearning for connection based on nothing more than a brief encounter. The Dwellers didn't experience such feelings. Their world was one of efficiency, where relationships were formed out of necessity, not desire. Yet here were Stacy and John, two individuals connected by the most improbable of coincidences, and they couldn't stop thinking about each other. In the quiet of the Watcher, Lonni began to reflect on her own existence. Her life, like that of all Dwellers, had been governed by data, by logic, by the pursuit of knowledge. There was no room for emotion, no need for the kind of longing that seemed to drive humans. But as she observed John and Stacy, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something missing in her own life. Could it be, Lonni pondered, that humans, for all their inefficiencies and contradictions, possessed something the Dwellers had lost long ago? Lonnie's thoughts drifted back to her observations of Stacy in her studio. There was a moment she had captured, A simple, quiet moment when Stacy had paused in her painting, her gaze distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. She had been thinking about the man on the trolley. Lonni knew that much. But what fascinated Lonni was the expression on Stacy's face. A soft smile, tinged with something undefinable, something that Lonni couldn't quite put into words. It was as if Stacy, in that moment, was reaching out for something she couldn't see, something she didn't even know she wanted. John's life, too, had its moments of quiet reflection. Lonni had watched him one evening as he sat at his desk, long after the workday had ended. He had finished his reports, yet instead of leaving the office, he remained seated, his gaze fixed on the window overlooking the city. The lights of St. Louis glittered in the distance, but John's thoughts were elsewhere. He was thinking about Stacy, though he didn't know her name. There was a restlessness in him, a need for something more than the routine of his daily life. Lonni found herself pondering these moments long after she had logged them. What was it that humans sought in each other? She wondered. Was it connection? Understanding? Or was it something deeper? Something intangible that couldn't be measured or quantified? The days passed, and Lonni continued her study, her fascination with John and Stacy growing with each new observation. She watched as Stacy prepared for another exhibit, her hands trembling slightly as she framed her latest pieces. She saw the nervousness in Stacy's eyes, the way she bit her lip as she hung the paintings on the gallery wall, each one a part of herself displayed for the world to see. Lonni admired the bravery it took to create something so personal and share it with others. John, on the other hand, remained firmly rooted in his world of logic, yet even he wasn't immune to the pull of the unknown. Lonni observed him one evening as he stood in his apartment, staring out the window at the city below. His expression was thoughtful, his mind clearly elsewhere. He was thinking about her again. Stacy. The woman he had met only in passing, yet who seemed to occupy a space in his thoughts that no amount of data could explain. For Lonni, these 3 weeks had been a journey into the heart of what it meant to be human. She had learned more about Stacy and John than she had ever expected, but in doing so, she had also learned something about herself. The Dwellers, for all their knowledge and efficiency, lacked something fundamental, a connection to the world around them, to each other. They existed in isolation, each mind focused on its own tasks, its own goals. But humans were different. They reached out for one another, even when they didn't know why. As Lonni sat in the quiet of the Watcher, she couldn't help but wonder if the Dwellers had lost something important along the way. Perhaps there was more to life than data and results, Lonni mused. Perhaps there was something to be learned from the humans, something that couldn't be measured in probabilities or statistics. And as she continued to study Stacy and John, Lonni found herself longing, for the first time in her life, to understand what it felt like to be human.